Emma dreaded coming home to her apartment. She tried to brush off the feeling, to convince herself that she was fine, but there was something about the cold, quiet space that made her feel more alone than anywhere else. Each night, when she opened the door, she felt like she was stepping into a tomb. The stillness pressed down on her, heavy and inescapable, and the first thing she did, almost without thinking, was to reach for the television remote. The hum of voices on the screen offered a strange kind of comfort, filling the air with reminders of life outside her walls. She didn't need to know the plot, or the characters, she just needed the sound of someone speaking. Anything to break the silence. Her evenings followed a familiar routine, a quick, unremarkable dinner for one, eaten in front of the TV as she absent-mindedly flipped channels. After dinner, she would read a few pages from a book, her eyes skimming over the words but never really sinking in. Eventually, she'd go to bed, hoping that sleep would come quickly and carry her away from the emptiness. But even in the darkness, her mind would wander to the past, to relationships that had started with promise and ended in heartache. She would remember faces, conversations, laughter that had faded, leaving only memories she wasn't quite ready to let go of. She wondered if people had seen it, this loneliness in her eyes, and maybe turned away, sensing the invisible distance that grew around her. Saturdays were the hardest. She'd take herself to the local mall, trying to pretend that she was just another shopper enjoying a day out. But everywhere she looked, there were couples strolling hand in hand, parents laughing with their children, friends huddled together over coffee. They all seemed to have what she was missing: companionship, connection, warmth. She would watch them, feeling a mixture of longing and resignation, as if she were on the outside of life, pressing her face to the glass, watching everyone else move through a world that felt just out of reach. One weekend, as she wandered through the mall, she stopped by a small bookstore and found herself drawn to the self-help section. Her fingers brushed over titles that promised happiness, fulfillment, love, answers to questions she'd been carrying for years. But a small book with a plain cover caught her eye. It was a worn Bible, used and faded. She picked it up, hesitating for a moment before opening it. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes fell on a verse from Psalms.
The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Psalm 34 verse 18.
The words struck her like a quiet whisper in the midst of the noise, something gentle and true. Emma bought the Bible and took it home, unsure of what to expect. That night, instead of turning on the television, she opened the Bible to the Psalms and began reading. She read words that spoke of sorrow, of loneliness, of crying out to God in the midst of despair, and of a God who listened, who saw, who cared. There was something strangely comforting in those ancient words, as if they were speaking directly to her heart, acknowledging her loneliness in a way she hadn't allowed herself to. She felt a warmth stir inside her, a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Over the next few weeks, she began a new habit. Each evening, she would light a candle, sit down with her Bible, and read. Some nights, she read only a few verses, other nights, she'd lose herself in the words, feeling her heart lift as she discovered stories of people who had walked through loneliness, fear, and uncertainty, yet found comfort and strength in God. She began to pray, not with fancy words or expectations, but simply talking to God about her day, her fears, her loneliness. She didn't feel an immediate change, but there was a quiet reassurance that settled in her, a sense that she was being heard, seen, and loved. One evening, she came across a verse in Isaiah.
When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. Isaiah 43 verse 2.
Emma realized that the promise wasn't that life would be easy or free of loneliness, but that God would be with her through it all, holding her hand even in the silent, empty places. She began to think of her apartment not as a place of loneliness but as a place of peace, a sanctuary where she could meet with God, talk to Him, and feel His presence in the stillness. She started praying for strength to let go of her past, to forgive herself and others, to trust that God's love was enough, even if it didn't always take away the ache. Her weekends changed, too. Instead of wandering the mall, she volunteered at a local shelter, helping serve meals to those in need. She met people who were also alone, people who had lost more than she could imagine, and yet found comfort in simple kindness. She began to feel connected to them, to see her own struggles reflected in their eyes, and as she gave of herself, the weight of her own loneliness began to lift. One Sunday at church, after months of feeling invisible, a woman sitting next to her turned and introduced herself. They started talking, and over time, Emma found herself part of a small group of friends who encouraged one another, prayed for one another, and shared their lives. They were all carrying their own struggles, but there was something sacred in sharing those burdens, in knowing that they weren't alone. And for the first time in years, Emma began to feel truly seen, not just by others but by God. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, watching the soft glow of her candle flicker, she thought back to the long, lonely nights that had once filled her with despair. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. Instead, it felt full of hope, of peace, of God's presence. She knew she might still feel lonely sometimes, that she might still long for companionship, but there was a quiet assurance in her heart now, a knowledge that she was never truly alone. Emma found herself whispering a prayer, a simple one, filled with gratitude.
Thank you, Lord, for meeting me in the quiet, for hearing the words I couldn't say, for filling my loneliness with your love. Help me remember, even in the hardest moments, that you are here.
And as she got ready for bed, she knew that whatever tomorrow held, she would face it with a strength that didn't come from her own will, but from a God who had been with her all along.